In just seconds, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't debate Karoline Leavitt. She dismantled her, live on national television. Her words didn't just shake the studio, they detonated across America, leaving millions stunned and forcing a retired judge to confess, "Last night I cried." What did Jasmine Crockett say that turned a political showdown into a national awakening and left Karoline Leavitt frozen on air? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio lights hit hard, cold and merciless. They weren't there to make anyone look good. They were there to expose, to strip away the gloss and leave behind only what was real. The room was quiet, but it wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence right before a storm, when even the air holds its breath. Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage like she owned it. Every step was confident, practiced, almost theatrical. Her heels struck the floor like a gavel. Her smile was flawless, but empty. The kind built for press photos, not people. Her red blazer wasn't fashion, it was armor. Her hair didn't move. Her eyes never searched. She didn't need to look for anyone. In her mind, she was already the center. Everything about her said, "I came to win. I came to be watched." And then Jasmine entered. No spotlight followed her, no dramatic pause, just the quiet shift of attention, like a cold draft entering the room. She didn't walk fast. She didn't walk slow. She walked like a woman who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to fight for. Her suit was plain, navy, firm, not flashy. It said, "I'm not here for the show." In her hands, there was no sleek device, no thick policy binder. Only a folder, worn at the edges, held together by memory. She placed it in front of her like something sacred. Inside was a letter, creased, old, and written in the kind of handwriting that's slow and careful, like every word matters. And behind it, a photo, a boy in a hoodie, one eye swollen shut, his face young, soft, broken, his story unspoken, but screaming through the image. Jasmine didn't glance at the camera. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any speech Karoline had ever rehearsed. She wasn't here to compete. She was here to confront. The camera held steady on Jasmine for a moment longer, just long enough for the audience to wonder if she might explode or say nothing at all, before the host finally leaned forward, voice calm but laced with the kind of tension that only comes when the next question might set the whole room on fire. The moderator's hands trembled slightly, though his voice didn't show it, yet. He glanced down at the card in front of him, but he already knew the question. Everyone did. It wasn't new. It wasn't safe. It was the kind of question that didn't just ask for answers. It demanded a reckoning. He looked up, first at Karoline, then at Jasmine, then into the cold red glow of the camera. "Tonight," he said, his tone low and precise, "we ask a question that's divided this nation for generations. A question many would rather ignore, but we're not here to look away." A pause, a breath, and then, delivered like a verdict. Is the American justice system truly fair for everyone? The question hit the floor like a loaded weapon, silent, heavy, waiting. And before the air could settle, Karoline leaned forward with a smile so polished it could have come straight out of a campaign ad. She nodded once, calmly, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Let's be real," she began, her voice smooth and steady. "America isn't perfect. No country is. But we've come a long way." Her tone was clear, confident, not rushed, not nervous. "We've had a black president twice. There are black billionaires, black CEOs. We've got mayors, governors, and judges of every background. If the system was built to keep people down, how did they get up?" She let the question hang there, like she had just proved her point without needing to argue. Her fingers touched the desk lightly, relaxed, composed. "That's not oppression," she added. "That's progress." The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't cold. It was calculating. People were listening. Karoline saw it, and she leaned in a little more. "The system gives everyone the same shot," she said. "It doesn't promise success, but it gives you a chance. What you do with that chance, that's up to you." She smiled again, smaller this time, like she was being reasonable. And if we keep blaming the system every time someone fails, we're not helping them. We're teaching them to give up before they even try. Now her eyes locked on the camera. We can't fix everything by changing laws that already protect everyone equally. Sometimes the problem isn't the rules, it's the mindset. If you walk around thinking you're already defeated, then of course you lose. She folded her hands, resting them on the desk. We should be focusing on building confidence, not spreading doubt. We should remind people they're strong, not tell them they're stuck. Her voice didn't shake once. It was calm, controlled. She knew exactly what she was doing. Karoline's final words hung in the air like a flag planted on a battlefield. But across from her, Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even blink. And the longer that silence stretched, the more it felt like something far more dangerous than disagreement was coming. Jasmine stayed still, completely still. The kind of stillness that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. Her hands were folded, her shoulders square, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Not on Karoline, not on the camera, but just past them, like she was looking at something no one else could see. 10 seconds passed, then 15. The audience started to shift in their seats. A cough was swallowed. A pencil stopped scribbling. Somewhere off camera, a stagehand muttered under their breath, unsure if she had forgotten her lines or was simply refusing to play the game. The tension kept building. Not loud, not messy, but slow and deep, like pressure in a sealed room. Some thought she was stalling. Others thought she had frozen. But she hadn't. She was choosing the moment. And when she finally spoke, it was like someone pulling a trigger with no warning. "The system works," Jasmine said, her voice low but steady, "just not for all of us." That was all. One sentence, delivered without emotion, but carrying the weight of 1,000 buried stories. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't blink. But the effect was immediate, like a cold wind cutting through a room full of warm lights. The simplicity made it brutal. The restraint made it powerful. She wasn't trying to argue. She wasn't trying to persuade. She was stating a fact and daring anyone to say otherwise. Karoline's smile twitched but didn't break. The moderator didn't speak. The room didn't breathe. Because Jasmine's words didn't need volume. They needed silence. And that silence came fast, thick, and absolute. The silence after her words wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the room itself had paused to brace for something deeper, something harder to swallow. And Jasmine, still calm, still centered, let that weight settle before she opened the folder in front of her and began to speak. Not to win, not to impress, but to remember. "I want to tell you about my first case," Jasmine said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "His name was Darius, 17 years old, no priors, never in trouble, barely even spoke in class. He spent his afternoons tutoring other kids in math." Her gaze didn't wander, but her words landed with focus, like each one was stepping deliberately into a minefield. "One night, he was walking home, alone. Hoodie pulled tight because it was cold. A liquor store 2 blocks away had just been robbed. 2 officers saw him, said he fit the description. That was it. No mask, no bag, no weapon. Just wrong place, wrong skin, wrong time." She paused, but not for drama, for truth to settle. "They cuffed him on the spot," she continued, still calm, but firmer now. "Didn't call his parents, didn't read him his rights, didn't check the timestamp on the 911 call. They just made him sit in the back of a squad car and wait." Her fingers gently tapped the folder in front of her. "I saw the police report. It was thin, barely a paragraph long, and yet that one paragraph was enough to charge him, enough to strip his name and replace it with a number." She drew in a breath, steady but heavy. "But I had the proof. The tutoring center had security footage. His name was in the logbook. He was across town at the exact time the robbery happened. I thought it would be open and shut. I thought the truth would matter." She let that sentence hang, the kind that begs for a reaction. But there was none. Only stillness, only waiting. "I presented everything," she said, her voice steady but tightening at the edges. "The video, the timestamp, the statement from the tutor who saw him leave. Everything lined up. Everything said he was innocent." She shifted slightly in her chair, the only movement she'd made since she began. But no one in that courtroom looked at the evidence the way I did. They looked at him, just him, a quiet black teenager in a hoodie, and in their eyes that was already close enough to guilty. Her jaw tensed, but she didn't raise her voice. They never asked why the officers didn't question the two white kids walking 5 feet behind him. They never asked why no one checked for prints or surveillance footage at the store. They didn't care about the gaps. They just needed a name to attach to the crime. The air in the room tightened, a silence thick enough to feel on the skin. "He was sentenced to 3 years, Jasmine said, her voice dropping just above a whisper now. 3 years. For existing in the wrong zip code, wearing the wrong hoodie, walking home at the wrong time." Her eyes didn't move, but they carried weight now, directed at no one and yet hitting everyone. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't ask why. He just looked at me, and I will never forget that look. It wasn't fear. It was familiarity, like he had known this was going to happen long before I stepped into that courtroom. She stopped speaking. The room didn't breathe. The stillness wasn't respectful. It was stunned. Jasmine didn't add more. She didn't need to, because what she had just done wasn't performative. It was a quiet, relentless indictment. Not just of a case, not just of a courtroom, but of a system that let Darius fall through the cracks and then blamed him for landing there. Jasmine's story settled over the room like smoke after a fire. Slow, suffocating, impossible to ignore. And just as the weight of it began to take root in silence, Karoline straightened in her seat and reached almost desperately for the cold comfort of numbers. Karoline inhaled, slow and deliberate, gathering herself like someone trying to push back rising water with a perfectly folded towel. Her voice, when it returned, was calm. Too calm. "That was powerful," she said, her words landing like carefully placed tiles rather than convictions. "Tragic, even. I don't doubt your experience. I don't question the pain in that story, but we have to draw a line between what moves us and what guides us." She leaned forward slightly as if trying to lean into reason. "Emotion has a place. Stories have value, but public policy can't be built on emotion alone. We need something more reliable. We need facts." Her hands, which had remained elegantly still all evening, now fidgeted slightly against each other. Because no matter how deeply a story touches us, it's still a single example. We don't make federal law based on one courtroom. We make it based on measurable, provable, repeatable data. She scanned the audience as though daring them to disagree with logic itself. If we want to change systems, we can't do it with feelings. We do it with frameworks, with patterns, with truth that can be verified, not just felt. Her words were cleaner now, flowing faster, sharper, like she had found her footing again, back on ground she could control. "The data shows progress," she continued. "Drop in crime rates, increase in minority-owned businesses, rising graduation rates in underserved schools. If the system were broken the way some claim, those numbers wouldn't exist." Her voice rose, not loud but pointed, like a teacher correcting a student who had confused empathy for expertise. "We have to be responsible. We can't turn policy into therapy. We can't let feelings dictate laws, because when emotion overrides structure, justice becomes chaos." She leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other, reclaiming her poise. "Look, I understand where the stories come from," she added, tone softer now, as if trying to clean the sharpness from her edge. "But we have to stay clear-headed. Passion can raise awareness, but it can't replace the rule of law." The silence that followed wasn't heavy like the one after Jasmine's story. It was thinner, colder. A pause born not from reflection, but from discomfort. Karoline had spoken clearly, logically, but the air didn't shift back in her direction. Because what she failed to see was that sometimes facts describe the road, but stories reveal the wreckage. Karoline's logic landed with the precision of a math equation. But equations don't bleed, and Jasmine, without raising her voice or shifting in her seat, turned slowly toward her opponent and broke the air like a blade slipping through still water. Jasmine didn't raise her tone. She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply turned her head, slow, deliberate, and looked Karoline straight in the face. Her eyes didn't carry anger. They carried something heavier, the kind of stillness that follows too many funerals, too many folded flags, too many names read aloud in rooms just like this one. Then she spoke, voice low but cutting, with the sharpness of truth. "So you think the law doesn't need a heart?" The question didn't come with fire, it came with finality. The kind of question that doesn't ask to be answered, because the silence it lands in already is the answer. A beat passed, then another. Karoline didn't respond. Couldn't. Jasmine didn't look at her again. She turned back to the audience, to the cameras, to the country, and quietly nodded once toward the screen behind her. The lights in the studio dimmed, not dramatically, but just enough for the background to take center stage. A black and white image appeared, almost too quickly. It was a child, 12 years old, standing in a snowy park with a toy gun in his hand. His eyes were soft, curious, caught mid-thought, as if he wasn't ready for the photo to be taken. Beneath the image, a simple caption appeared. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, shot in under 2 seconds. No warning. Jasmine didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. The image loomed behind her like a silent witness. "He was playing," she said softly, hands still folded in front of her. They didn't ask questions. They didn't yell a command. They pulled up, opened the door, and fired. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The truth didn't need volume. It needed space, and it had it. The screen faded to black, then lit up again. Another face. This one older. A young black woman sitting for a mugshot, her eyes holding something between shock and defiance. Sandra Bland. Pulled over for failing to signal a lane change. Found dead in her jail cell. 3 days later. The caption didn't ask for sympathy. It demanded memory. Jasmine's voice stayed steady. They said she was combative. She asked why she was being arrested. She never made it home. They said it was suicide, but they never explained the bruises. There was no dramatization in her tone, just exhaustion, just a retelling of what too many people already knew, and too many chose to forget. The screen changed again. Philando Castile, a still from the police body cam footage. His eyes were focused ahead, his girlfriend beside him, a child in the back seat, told the officer he had a licensed firearm, reached for his wallet, shot 7 times. Jasmine's voice lowered, almost into a whisper. He did everything right, told the truth, kept calm, complied, and they still killed him. She paused. The silence was no longer still. It was tense, thick, sacred. His daughter watched it happen from the back seat. That's the memory she lives with now. Another shift on the screen, a face half lit, another name, another caption, another time someone didn't make it home. Jasmine didn't narrate them all. She didn't need to. The images spoke now, faces fading in and out behind her. Names, dates, locations. Some had been on the news, others barely made headlines. Some were still under investigation, most weren't. The audience no longer shifted in their seats. They didn't look down. They didn't check their phones. Even the moderator's notes stayed untouched in front of him, his fingers curled against the edges like he was holding on to something he didn't want to drop. Jasmine took a breath, not for herself, but for them. "You say we can't write policy with emotion," she said, finally breaking the silence again. "But tell me, what part of these stories isn't policy?" Her voice didn't rise, but it did tighten. The stop that never should have happened? That was policy. The officer who never faced charges? That was policy. The silence that followed? That was policy too. She looked out across the studio, not accusing, not pleading, but pressing, gently, relentlessly. What you call emotion, I call memory. What you call anecdote, I call evidence. And what you call progress, I call names that never made it home. The screen faded again. This time nothing appeared. Just black. Just void. She turned her body slightly, finally looking back at Karoline. Not to debate, but to finish. "You want data?" she said. "Here it is. Name after name. Case after case. Do you need a spreadsheet to believe they were real?" A long pause followed. Not awkward, not performative. Just heavy. "Because I promise you, their families never got a graph. They got a call, or a knock at the door, or silence that lasted for the rest of their lives. Her voice softened again, but the softness wasn't weakness. It was a warning. You say the law should be cold. I say it's already too cold. Cold enough to watch a child die and call it compliance. Cold enough to erase a life with paperwork. Cold enough to call what's happening fair just because it's legal. Jasmine stepped back from the desk, not to walk away, but to let the weight of everything she'd said settle like dust in a room that had just stopped breathing. So no, she said finally, we don't need less feeling. We need more, because laws without compassion are just rules, and rules can kill too. The silence still hung in the air, thick with names and memories. But Karoline, refusing to lose the floor completely, shifted the conversation again, this time toward personal responsibility and inter-community crime, trying to pull the weight of the discussion away from systems and back onto individuals. But Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't retreat, and absolutely didn't let it slide. Karoline straightened in her chair, her voice sharper now, stripped of the softness she had used earlier. At some point, she said, we have to talk about accountability. We have to talk about choices. If we're going to be honest, we can't ignore black-on-black crime. We can't blame the system forever if people don't take responsibility for their own communities. Her tone was tight, fast, like someone trying to outrun the gravity of what had just been said. She kept her eyes forward, trying to sound firm, reasonable, in control. We have to stop encouraging a culture of victimhood, she added. No one's saying the system is perfect, but at some point, we all have to look in the mirror. It was the kind of argument that sounded logical on the surface, but Jasmine knew exactly what was buried underneath it. She didn't react right away. She didn't jump in. She let the words sit there, exposed and fragile. And then, with a stillness that made the room lean forward, she spoke. You keep asking why people don't rise, she said, her voice low but clear. But never ask how many ladders the system already pulled away. Her gaze cut across the table, not with anger, but with the weight of someone who'd seen too much to pretend anymore. Don't just ask the poor why they didn't climb, she continued. Ask how many times they were shoved back down before they even got a chance. Her words weren't fast, they were deliberate, controlled, but each one landed like a hammer against glass. You want to talk about black-on-black crime? She said, her voice steady. Then let's talk about neighborhoods where resources were stripped for decades, schools that were defunded before the first bell rang, playgrounds left to rot, grocery stores replaced with pawn shops and liquor stores, and the only thing the city invested in? She paused, eyes unwavering. Police. The word echoed, not shouted, just heavy, just true. When you over-police and underfund a community for a generation, she said, you don't get safety, you get a pressure cooker, and when it blows, you stand outside and point fingers at the people still inside the flames. The audience didn't move. Not even a breath was wasted. And don't talk to me about responsibility, she went on, because we show up, we vote, we march, we organize, we open small businesses, we raise families, we rebuild every time the system fails us. But responsibility without opportunity is just survival dressed up as choice. Her hands stayed on the table, but her presence filled the room now, dense, unmoving, undeniable. You want to ask about crime? Ask about the policies that built desperation. Ask about the housing discrimination that kept families trapped. Ask about the wages that don't stretch past the 15th of the month. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't waver, because she wasn't searching for sympathy. She was naming facts. Then she stopped, just long enough for the room to feel the silence again. And in that quiet, she delivered the final line, not shouted, not forced, but sharpened to a point. If success is possible for everyone, she said, why do only some ever get to survive failure? The room was already quiet, but Jasmine's last words had changed the silence. No longer stunned, but searching. And in that stillness, she turned, not just to Karoline, but to the audience itself, her voice shifting from resistance to reckoning. She looked out over the crowd, scanning the rows like she wasn't just speaking to them, but for someone sitting in the back, someone who had been waiting a long time to be seen. Let me ask the men in this room something, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying weight without ever rising. Especially the ones who've worn a uniform, who've sweated in factories, who've hauled concrete, who've bled on foreign soil and come home believing you'd earned a fair shot. She paused just long enough to let the image settle. If you worked your whole life, followed the rules, paid your dues, and then watched your son get denied for a loan, same paperwork, same income, same credit score, but a different shade of skin, would you still say this system is fair to every child? Her words didn't echo. They stuck, like the kind of question that doesn't ask for an answer, but demands a reckoning. She stepped forward, just one step, but it changed everything. 2 applications, she said. Same numbers, same debt-to-income ratio, same employment history. 1 approved, 1 denied. Guess which one had the black name? Her voice didn't crack. Her hands didn't move. But her presence swelled, like someone pulling receipts straight from the bones of the system. The Federal Reserve's own study says black applicants are 40% more likely to be denied a mortgage, even when their finances match white applicants exactly. She let the number hang in the air like a charge about to ignite. That's not theory. That's not emotion. That's a documented statistical fact. And it's not from 50 years ago. It's right now. The screen behind her lit up again, this time with 2 mock loan applications. Identical numbers, different names. One labeled approved, the other denied. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. She'd lived it. She'd fought it. She'd read those rejection letters in the hands of people who had followed every rule and still been told no. We keep telling our kids to dream big, she said, her voice lower now, steadier, more personal. We tell them if they study hard, work late, keep their head down, they can build a future. But how do you build when the doors stay locked, even when you have the key? She looked straight into the camera now, like speaking not just to the room, but to every living room, every porch, every barber shop across the country. You want to talk about fairness? She asked. Fairness is when a white man and a black man can walk into the same bank with the same paperwork and leave with the same opportunity. Not just a pat on the back and a pamphlet that says better luck next time. Her hands opened slightly now, not gesturing for effect, but from the simple tension of holding too much truth too tightly. This system doesn't just deny access, she continued. It denies trust. It tells people over and over again, we'll let you try, but we won't let you win. She let the silence build again, not from hesitation, but because some words deserve the space to echo. And don't tell me it's just about the math, she said, because if this were just about numbers, the numbers wouldn't lie in the same direction, again and again and again. Her tone was sharper now, but not louder. It was the sharpness of precision, the sound of someone who had stripped every excuse down to the bone. It's not an accident. It's not a glitch. It's a design. And designs don't change by pretending they're fair. They change when we call them out. Another image appeared on the screen behind her. A map of mortgage rejection rates by neighborhood, color-coded in red and blue. The red areas clustered where black and brown families lived. The blue where white families lived. The pattern was unmistakable. Jasmine turned slightly, her voice softening, not in surrender, but in sorrow. You want to know what hopelessness sounds like? She said. It sounds like a father telling his daughter she won't be going to college this year, not because her grades weren't good enough, but because the bank wouldn't lend him the money, even with 20 years of clean credit. She let that image breathe. And when that little girl asks why, what does he say? That he didn't try hard enough? Or does he finally tell her the truth? That the system they taught her to believe in never believed in them? She turned fully now, back to the audience, her eyes unwavering. You want fairness? She said. Then stop pretending access and opportunity are the same thing. One is printed on a brochure. The other decides where your child sleeps at night. One is a promise. The other is a gate. She exhaled slowly, not dramatically, but like someone laying down something they've carried too long. And if this country truly wants to call itself fair, then it needs to stop asking why some of us haven't reached the top and start asking how many times it let the ground collapse beneath our feet. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that moment, no one could. The screen behind her dimmed, but the weight of what Jasmine had laid bare did not. And as the room braced itself for another point, another argument, another volley in the debate, Jasmine did something far more dangerous. She sat down, folded a piece of paper in half, and made the studio feel more like a funeral than a forum. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at Karoline. She didn't look at the moderator. Jasmine lowered herself into the chair with a slow, controlled motion, like someone returning to the truth after carrying too much of it for too long. Her blazer didn't shift. Her voice didn't break. She reached into her folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, precisely, like it had been held many times before, and placed it flat on the table in front of her. One hand rested lightly on top of it, the other curled at her side, still. The camera zoomed in instinctively, drawn not by action, but by silence. And when she finally opened her mouth, it wasn't to argue. It was to remember. "Tamir," she said. The name hit the room like a drop pin in a cathedral. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. "Sandra." A shift in the audience, not movement, just breathe. The kind people try to take quietly when they suddenly realize they've been holding it. "Philando." 3 names, 3 stories, 3 lives turned into hashtags and headlines, reduced and debated until grief itself became political currency. Jasmine didn't recite dates. She didn't give statistics. She didn't cite articles. She let the names hang in the air like the beginning of a prayer. And then, with quiet finality, she said, "They are not data. They are people." She turned her head slowly, not sharply, to face the audience. Not just the people in the seats, but the ones at home. The ones watching from break rooms, classrooms, living rooms across the country. And her voice, though still low, held a force that was impossible to turn away from. "And if no one in this room," she said, scanning row by row, "is willing to stand up and say they deserve to die, then why are they dead?" There was no reply. None was possible. The question landed like an earthquake. Quiet at first, then total. The kind of silence that no one dares to interrupt. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed to fade. The moderator looked down at his cards but did not speak. Karoline sat still, hands clasped in front of her, her polished posture now stiff and frozen. The audience wasn't just quiet, they were held. Caught in a moment that was no longer about sides or sound bites. It was no longer a debate. It had become something else. Jasmine reached for the folded paper again, not to lift it, but to smooth it with the flat of her palm. It was a ritual now, gentle, deliberate, respectful. "I keep this list," she said, almost as if she were explaining it to herself, "because if I don't say their names out loud, they disappear again. Not just from memory, but from meaning." Her fingers brushed the crease, then paused. "We're told to move on, to forgive, to focus on the future. But how do you build a future if the past still bleeds through the floor?" She looked back up, not with fire, not with fury, but with something colder, something older, the kind of grief that has calcified into a kind of knowing. "People say this conversation is uncomfortable," she said. "Good, it should be." Her eyes swept the room again. "Because for some of us, discomfort is not a moment. It's a daily condition. It's walking through a store and being followed. It's being pulled over and rehearsing how not to die. It's kissing your kid goodbye in the morning and praying that's not the last time." Another pause, another beat. The sound of someone trying not to cry in the third row was barely audible, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't comfort. She didn't slow down. "We've been told to stay calm while watching people we love vanish," she said. "We've been told to be civil while burying friends, cousins, students, sons. And now when we ask to be heard, we're told it's too emotional, too dramatic, too inconvenient." She let the accusation hang. No name attached. But everyone knew who it was meant for. Her hand lifted from the page now. Not for emphasis, just to let it breathe. "These names aren't politics," she said. "They're memories. And if we don't speak them, clearly, loudly, without shame, then the silence will rewrite their stories into something we never agreed to." She leaned back in her chair slowly, folding her hands in her lap. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper now. but it carried with terrifying clarity. So I will say it again. If no one will say they deserve to die, then why did the system treat them like they did? No applause, no gasps, just stillness, the kind that feels sacred. And in that moment, the studio changed. The lights still shone, the cameras still rolled, but the space had transformed from a televised debate into a kind of reckoning, a vigil without candles, a courtroom without a judge. Jasmine sat still, her folded paper in front of her, unmoved. But what she had done, what she had undone, could be felt in every breath that now passed through the audience like a ghost. No rebuttal came. Because what do you say to names that never got to speak for themselves? The moment stretched, and then kept stretching. Not because no one knew what to say, but because they knew in their hearts that anything said next would only prove Jasmine's point. The silence held, deep, reverent, unshaken, until Jasmine finally lifted her eyes one last time. Not to the moderator, not to her opponent, but to the camera itself where the nation waited on the other side, not with questions, but with breath held tight between guilt and recognition. She looked into that lens like it was a person, like it was the eyes of every home that had ever dared to watch without fully seeing. Her gaze didn't tremble. It didn't beg. It reached. "I don't need your pity," she said, her voice steady, clear, and stripped bare of performance. "I need you to listen." It wasn't a plea. It was a directive. She didn't blink. She didn't soften. Her face remained still, but the power behind the words hit like a quiet reckoning. "We're not here to ask," she continued. "We're here because we're exhausted. Exhausted from waiting for silence to save us. Exhausted from hoping that patience would one day be enough." A pause, not for effect, but because the next line didn't need momentum, it needed truth. "We came because we've run out of time to wait for a miracle born from silence." Her voice did not rise, but in that moment it felt as though the room itself leaned toward her, as if every wall, every light, every inch of air had been called into attention. And across the country, viewers sat frozen, remote controls forgotten, phones untouched. Something deeper was happening, a shift, a wound being shown, not for sympathy, but for memory, not to incite, but to refuse to be erased. Jasmine didn't move right away. She let those last words sink in, not only into the air, but into the weight of the moment now fully formed around her like armor. The moderator remained silent. Karoline kept her posture, but the mask of control was no longer airtight. Even the studio crew behind the cameras stood still, not out of protocol, but respect. And then, without another word, Jasmine stood, slowly, purposefully. Her chair scraped lightly against the floor, the only sound in a room where nothing dared to speak. She didn't turn to the moderator. She didn't shake hands. She didn't wait for a commercial break or a closing remark. She picked up the folded piece of paper, now weathered from her touch, and slipped it gently into the inside pocket of her blazer, right where her heart was. Then she walked, but not to the wings, not to the exit behind the stage. She walked forward, straight down the center aisle of the audience, through the long line of seats, past silent faces now watching her, not as a politician, but as something else entirely, a witness, a vessel, a truth they could no longer unsee. Each step echoed, not loudly but precisely, like the beat of a slow drum marking the end of something old, and the beginning of something long overdue. The audience didn't speak. They didn't shift. They simply watched, some with eyes glassy, some with jaws set tight, breath clenched in the throat. Jasmine's pace didn't falter. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation, not for power, but for permanence. As she passed each row, it felt like moving through memory, like she was walking between ghosts, not imagined ones, real ones. Names she'd spoken, names the world had buried in headlines, in hashtags, in silence. Tamir, Sandra, Philando, and the ones she hadn't had time to say aloud. In that moment, the studio didn't feel like a debate stage. It felt like a memorial, a place where something sacred had been said and could not be unsaid. She reached the doors at the back of the audience. Still no applause. No music. No cut to commercial. Just stillness, heavy and full. Jasmine paused for the briefest second, one hand on the door handle. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Everything behind her had already changed. Then with one last quiet breath, she opened the door and stepped out. And the show, though technically still live, had nothing left to show. Jasmine didn't need a standing ovation, and she didn't wait for one. She walked through that room like she was walking through history itself, through pain, through memory, through generations of silence finally broken. But the moment didn't end when the cameras cut. That was just when the echo began. The letter arrived 2 days later. Thick envelope, ivory stock, the kind of stationery people don't use anymore. Unless they were raised in courtrooms and carry their words like rulings. It was handwritten, careful, in slightly shaky cursive. No return address beyond a city and a zip code. Jasmine sat at her kitchen table when she opened it, her fingers still marked with the quiet from the night before. The words read simply, "I served as a judge for 31 years. I once believed I was too old to change, but last night I cried." There was no preamble, no formalities, just the truth of someone who had once signed his name on the sentences that changed lives, and now wasn't sure he had always signed injustice. "I saw in your voice the weight of names I never remembered long enough. You didn't ask for permission to speak. You asked us to remember, and I did. Thank you for not letting silence win." Jasmine folded the letter gently and placed it in the same folder that had carried the names. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But she sat a little longer in her chair, holding it like a verdict that had come far too late, but had still arrived. In a small town outside Birmingham, a former Marine woke up at 5:30 a.m. like he always did, muscle memory long outlasting the battlefield. He didn't say much to his wife, just made coffee, buttered toast, and opened his iPad. The clip had been saved to his home screen. Jasmine's face froze in mid-sentence, calm, eyes steady, backlit by silence. He hit play, watched it all again. Then he opened the church's newsletter software, found the week's bulletin layout, and deleted the scripture quote at the top. Instead, he pasted her words. "We don't need pity. We need people to listen. We're not here to ask. We're here because silence never saved us." Then he printed it, pinned it to the bulletin board just inside the chapel doors. Didn't sign it, didn't explain it. Just stood for a moment, staring at the printed paper, then nodded once to himself, like a soldier recognizing a new commander, and walked out into the sun. In a quiet suburb outside St. Louis, an older man sat with his son and a plate of reheated leftovers between them. The kitchen TV played the segment on loop. Jasmine's speech, clear, slow, without music or edits, filling the room like a sermon no one had expected. The man, gray-haired, retired teacher, said nothing at first, just chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving the screen. His son sat beside him, one arm draped behind the chair, watching, but less closely. When the clip ended, the father turned to him. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "you need to teach your boy something new." His son blinked. "Teach him what?" The father stared at the blank screen for a beat before answering. "Not just how to succeed, not just how to be smart. Teach him how to survive." There was no anger in his voice, no panic, just a depth. A weight that could only come from having seen too many funerals with boys who had memorized multiplication tables, but not how to keep their hands visible when pulled over. Teach him how to stay alive. At a dusty VFW hall in rural Ohio, a group of veterans watched the clip on an old projector. The sound wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. As Jasmine listed the names, the room fell still, not out of formality, but recognition. These were not their wars, but they understood the gravity of a list that ended in silence. One man in his 70s muttered under his breath, "We trained to take orders." She stood there and gave truth. No one laughed. No one disagreed. After the clip ended, they didn't move for a while. Finally, one of them stood and went to the front board. He erased the schedule for next week's BBQ fundraiser and wrote in block letters, "Next meeting, community dialogue, justice, not just memory." Someone clapped once, quietly. Then they all stood, slower than they used to, but not unsure. And in homes across the country, in small apartments, in nursing homes, in classrooms and bus stations and church pews, people weren't just watching, they were feeling. They were repeating her name, sharing her voice, listening not just for what she had said, but for what they had never dared to say themselves. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't just a clip, it was a call, and it was being answered. The morning sun filtered in through half-closed blinds, casting long, pale stripes across the rows of desks. The air was thick with the smell of pencil shavings, floor wax, and something heavier, something invisible but present. Anticipation. Room 204 at Lakewood High didn't usually feel like this. Mr. Langley's U.S. government class was known for being quiet, respectful, and, if most students were honest, mostly forgettable. But today wasn't most days. At exactly 8:03 a.m., Mr. Langley closed the door, locked it, and pulled down the screen above the whiteboard. He didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. His hand hovered over the projector remote, but his eyes scanned the room first. Every face. Juniors, 16 and 17 years old. Some sleepy, some curious. One or two already halfway through texting beneath the desk. He took a slow breath, then clicked play. The video started without a title card, no music. Just the familiar hum of studio lights and the sight of Jasmine Crockett sitting still in her chair, fingers folded, eyes calm. A few students shifted in their seats. One boy in the back muttered, "Is this another debate thing?" Mr. Langley didn't respond. He crossed his arms and leaned against the podium like he was watching it for the first time too. And then Jasmine spoke. The room changed. At first it was subtle. Phones lowered, not because of a rule, but because the voices on screen weren't shouting. They were telling the truth. Jasmine's words didn't come in fire. They came in cuts, one sentence at a time. Clean, precise, irrefutable. She spoke about the boy named Darius, about ladders being ripped away before anyone could climb, about names turned into silence, turned into hashtags, turned into nothing. And when she asked, if no one will say they deserve to die, then why did they? No one laughed. No one blinked. You could have heard a heartbeat. In the third row, a girl named Aria had tears forming at the corners of her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly, hoping no one saw. In the front, Jamal, who transferred from Jackson just last semester, leaned forward with his elbows on the desk, his knuckles whitening beneath his chin. Beside him, Rachel, who usually doodled through lectures, sat absolutely still, a highlighter gripped tight in her palm like it was anchoring her to something. At 8:27, the clip ended. The room stayed silent. Mr. Langley didn't reach for the remote. He didn't ask a question. He didn't break the moment. It was the kind of silence that deserved a stretch. Finally, after nearly a minute, he stepped forward and spoke. Quietly, slowly. That was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. A few heads nodded, but most were still locked in thought. He looked toward the windows where the light now slanted more directly into the room, revealing motes of dust spinning like time. I had a lesson planned today, something about the legislative process. I was going to show you how a bill becomes law, he paused. But this, what you just watched, that is civics. That is power. That is what it means when government meets the ground. In the back, a boy named Luis raised his hand. Was it real? Yes, Mr. Langley said. Every word. Another hand, Savannah. Did it change anything? He exhaled. Maybe not in Congress, not yet. But it's changing people, and that's where everything starts. He walked to the board and erased the day's objective. Understand the role of the Senate. In its place, he wrote in tall, even letters, who is the system for? Then he set the marker down and turned back to his students. We talk a lot about freedom, justice, equality, but those aren't just ideas, they're decisions. They're built or they're broken by what we ignore or what we face. No one looked away. He gestured toward the blank screen. She stood there, alone, in front of cameras, in front of people who didn't want to hear her. And she told the truth anyway. Not with noise, not with rage, with stillness. He nodded toward Jamal. You saw it? All of you did. Now I want to know, what did it make you feel? Jamal's voice came first, low but certain. Like someone finally said what everybody else pretends isn't happening. Savannah added, "It didn't feel like politics. It felt like a warning." From the side of the room, quiet Arya whispered, "It felt like church." That caught Mr. Langley. He looked at her. She wasn't crying now, just focused. "Why church?" he asked. "Because I didn't want to move. Because it made me feel something I wasn't ready for." He nodded once. "Good." Then he turned back to the board. "Write that down. What did it make you feel? What did it make you see?" Not one student hesitated. Not one complained. Pens hit paper like rain on pavement. Words poured out. For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds in room 204 were the soft scratch of ink and breath. When they finished, Mr. Langley collected nothing. He didn't assign it. He didn't grade it. He just said, "Keep it. Read it again tonight. Show someone who needs to hear it." As the bell rang, students stood quietly, many still reading what they'd just written. Some exchanged glances, small ones, honest ones, no jokes, no loud exits. And one boy, Marcus, usually the loudest in the room, walked past Mr. Langley and said under his breath, "My uncle's name should have been on that list." Then he walked out. Mr. Langley stood alone for a while in the quiet that remained. Then he walked over to the board and erased the question. In its place, he wrote, "If no one says they deserve to die, then why are they dead? JC." Then he sat down and started the clip again for the next class, because the lesson wasn't over. Not even close. The clock on the wall ticked past 7:01 a.m. In a nondescript municipal building 2 hours outside of Baton Rouge, the overhead fluorescents flickered to life in a narrow conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, old carpet, and long-buried tension. 12 uniformed officers sat around a battered table, their backs stiff against cheap plastic chairs. Some wore their duty belts. Others were off shift, summoned here with less than 12 hours' notice. None knew exactly why the chief had called them in early, but the tone in the memo was different. Director, uncompromising, mandatory attendance, no exceptions. Bring an open mind. The last line had thrown them. At 7:03, Chief Harold Sims stepped into the room, a folder under one arm and a portable speaker in the other. He was a tall, weather-worn man in his late 50s, buzz cut gone mostly silver, the corners of his mouth turned down in a permanent line of fatigue. He set the folder on the table, looked at every man and woman in the room, and said simply, "Close the door." An officer near the entrance pushed it shut. It clicked like a vault ceiling. Sims plugged in the speaker. No one asked what was about to happen. They all just watched. Then, without preamble, the screen of his tablet lit up, and Jasmine Crockett's face appeared, frozen mid-sentence. Calm, composed, coiled with purpose. He hit play. There was no music, no graphics, just Jasmine. She started with stillness, then names, then truth. At first, the room didn't react. Arms crossed, expressions locked, years of defense mechanisms held in place. But 10 seconds in, Sims watched a flicker, barely noticeable, in Officer Benton's jaw. Then another, a quiet sigh from Sergeant Torres, who leaned forward, her elbows suddenly tight on the table. Jasmine spoke of Darius. She spoke of courtroom silence. She spoke of hands visible, tone respectful, and still a gun drawn. When she said, "If no one says they deserve to die, then why are they dead?" Chief Sims didn't need to look up to know the air had changed. By the time the video ended, no one moved. It was Sims who broke the silence. "You all know me," he said, his voice steady but rough. "I don't do speeches. I don't hand out TED Talks. But last night, I watched this 4 times. I didn't sleep." He looked at Officer Clay, young, 3rd year on the force, quick to roll his eyes during city council meetings. Clay didn't meet his gaze now. "We've had 3 officer-involved complaints in the past 2 years," Sims continued. "No convictions, no formal discipline. One settled out of court." He tapped the folder on the table. "I can recite the justifications in my sleep. So can you. Procedure followed. Threat detected. Split-second decision. You know the lines." No one responded. "But that clip," he said, gesturing toward the now dark screen, "that wasn't about a split-second decision. That was about the weight of all our decisions. He looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one. Some of you think this doesn't apply to us because we're a small town, because we know our community. Let me ask you something. He stepped forward, palms on the table. When was the last time we reviewed our use of force policy line by line? When was the last time we invited community members to sit with us and talk? Not in a crisis, but in quiet? When was the last time we had to ask ourselves if someone walked away from a stop feeling less human than they did before? The room held its breath. Sims opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet, read aloud. We're not here to ask. We're here because we're tired of waiting for silence to save us. He folded the paper and placed it back inside. Anyone who thinks this doesn't apply to policing, he said, isn't listening. Captain Rourke cleared his throat. Chief, you saying we're the problem? Sims didn't flinch. I'm saying we're part of a system that can be the problem, and if we don't recognize that, we damn well will be. Torres spoke next, quiet but firm. I saw myself in that girl she talked about. Tiana, 14, doing everything right, still stopped, still searched. That could have been me. Hell, that was me. A younger officer, Patel, shifted in his seat. My cousin got pulled over in Atlanta last year. Same thing. Asked to step out for no reason. I never filed a complaint. Figured, what's the point? Silence. And then Sims laid down the proposal. Starting this month, we're opening a public forum, he said. Once a week. One officer, one community representative, one moderator. Unfiltered, unscripted. We're reviewing our training modules, especially de-escalation, and we're revising how we report stops, who we stop, and how long those records are reviewed. Not because we were forced to, because now's the time to do it. Clay finally looked up. This going to be mandatory? Sims stared him down. The badge isn't just about who you protect. It's about who trusts you to protect them. If that's a problem for you, yes, it's mandatory. No one laughed. No one resisted. After a pause, Rourke leaned back and murmured, we should print her transcript. Post it in the break room. Torres nodded. Or the front lobby. Sims glanced at the projector, then back to his team. Print it wherever you want. Just don't forget what it said. He picked up the speaker, turned it off, and walked toward the door. Before exiting, he stopped. You don't have to agree with everything she said, he said, but if that clip made you uncomfortable, that means you heard it right. Then he left. No order, or no salute, just truth. And behind him, for the first time in a long time, 12 officers sat. Not defensive, not combative, but still, listening, changing, together. The sun had almost disappeared behind the skyline when Jasmine finally let herself stop moving. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet for someone who had just turned the country upside down. No advisors, no staff, no cameras, just the soft hum of the air conditioning and the low creak of her leather chair as she sat down at the table by the window. Outside, the city exhaled, horns, sirens, footsteps. Life went on, but in here, everything felt paused, like the walls were still holding the weight of what she had said, what she had unleashed. She reached for the stack on the table. Letters, dozens, maybe hundreds, some typed, some handwritten in nervous cursive, some on lined notebook paper. A few arrived folded into envelopes so worn they looked like they'd traveled decades just to reach her. She picked one at random. It was from South Carolina, a man, late 70s. The handwriting shook slightly, but every letter was deliberate. Ma'am, I watched your speech with my granddaughter sitting beside me. I'm a retired postal worker. Never marched, never ran for office. But last night I cried, not because I hadn't heard those names, but because it was the first time I felt like someone said them for me. Jasmine closed her eyes just for a moment and breathed it in. She opened another. This one was a drawing, a child's hand, clumsy, colorful, bright. A woman with a microphone, big hair, dark suit, a giant red heart in her chest. At the bottom, you made me feel seen. Her throat tightened. The lamplight caught the corner of her old folder, creased, torn, still holding the same letter she'd carried into the studio. She reached for it, gently unfolded the photo tucked inside. Darius. That soft, unsure gaze beneath the shadow of a hoodie. She stared at it for a long while. Another envelope. No return address. Just block letters across the top. Jasmine Crockett. Keep speaking. Inside, a single sentence printed from an old typewriter. They told me I was too loud when I screamed. You were louder when you whispered. Thank you. She sat back in her chair. The city outside was now streaked in deep orange and navy blue. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Somewhere below, a saxophone played softly from a stoop. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The tears had already been shed, in classrooms, in squad cars, in dining rooms across the country. Instead, she sat there quietly, a hand resting gently on the letters like they were sacred. Like they were proof. Not of fame, not of victory, but of connection, of something shared. And in that stillness, as the dusk deepened into night, Jasmine Crockett realized something else. She hadn't lit a fire. She'd simply reminded the world it had been burning all along. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. 1.94 billion gone. No warning, no explanation, just gone. While kids went hungry and clinics shut down, one woman, Jasmine Crockett, walked into Congress with nothing but a binder and blew the lid off a national cover-up. What she revealed shocked the country and forced America to face a brutal truth. So ask yourself this: where did the money go, and who's paying the price right now? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from power. She came from struggle. Raised in the forgotten corners of Houston, she knew what it meant to live in places skipped by policy, where promises rarely arrived, and when they did, they came late and thin. Her mother cleaned offices at night, her school books were hand-me-downs, and justice was something you fought for, not something freely given. Jasmine fought. She became a lawyer not to join the system, but to confront it, defending tenants, teachers, veterans, anyone the system tried to ignore. She never chased fame, but when she uncovered that nearly $2 billion in federal aid had been rerouted, quietly, legally, and devastatingly, she knew she couldn't stay silent. The money was meant for school lunches, community clinics, affordable housing. Instead, it vanished through loopholes and sealed memos. No headlines, no debates. Jasmine traced the damage, neighborhood by neighborhood, person by person. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a deliberate decision made in silence. And so she requested a hearing, not to make noise, but to demand truth. With a weathered binder in hand and the weight of 1,000 unheard stories on her back, she stepped into Congress. Her question was, and so, with truth in her hands and fire in her step, Jasmine Crockett crossed the threshold into the hearing room. Not as a guest, but as a reckoning. The chamber was packed tight. Reporters lined the walls, cameras aimed, whispers buzzing like static before a lightning strike. Congressional staffers shuffled papers, but all eyes turned when Jasmine entered, calm, focused, and carrying nothing but a battered leather binder. She didn't wear power, she walked with it. Every step echoed, not with noise, but with intention. No entourage, no theatrics. Just the quiet force of someone who knew what was at stake. What she held wasn't opinion, it was evidence, and she was here to make silence impossible. Outside, the steps had become a rally. Out-of-work nurses, laid-off welders, aging veterans, they stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold, gripping handmade signs that read, "We see you. Show us where the money went." No more secrets. They weren't angry for attention. They were angry because they'd been forgotten. Their stories were the data Jasmine carried, their names, the footnotes no one read. And as she stepped deeper into the building, past marble columns and polished indifference, she wasn't just one woman with a binder. She was every voice they'd ignored. She sat without ceremony, but the silence that followed was louder than any gavel. Jasmine Crockett, sleeves rolled just enough to show she came to work, opened her worn binder like a surgeon exposing the wound. Across from her, Judge Richard Ellery adjusted his cufflinks, an old habit from the bench, a signal of control. He was the type of man who wore silence like armor, whose words came slow and polished, every sentence built like a verdict. For years, his decisions had redirected billions, cloaked in legal justifications and shielded by bureaucratic fog. No one challenged him. They couldn't, or wouldn't. But today, in front of cameras and restless truth, he was no longer the one asking the questions. Jasmine met his gaze, unshaken. Her voice was low, but every syllable landed like a stone. Judge Ellery, under your authorization, nearly $2 billion was diverted away from domestic programs. Programs that feed children, house veterans, fund rural hospitals. Who approved it? And why was it done in silence? A flicker, barely visible, passed over Ellery's face. His fingers pressed together, forming a steeple just beneath his chin. He had been prepared for criticism, maybe even outrage, but he hadn't expected this. Surgical precision wrapped in moral clarity. He leaned toward the microphone, voice steady but rehearsed. Miss Crockett, decisions of this scope are complex. These reallocations fall under a broader fiscal vision, structured to serve the nation's long-term strategic needs. Jasmine didn't blink. Her expression didn't shift. She let the pause hang in the air, heavy with disbelief, then spoke, calm but sharpened to a point. Strategic? She echoed. You call it strategic to cancel a mobile health unit that served 5 counties. Strategic to pull funding from job retraining for laid-off workers with no severance. Strategic to close mental health clinics where the suicide rate has doubled. She flipped to a tab marked in red, one of many, and held up a memo. This directive came from your office, Judge. It bypassed audit protocols, skipped public hearings, and reclassified essential services as non-critical. On paper, maybe that looks clean, but in real life, it looks like eviction notices. It looks like empty prescriptions. It looks like coffins. The room tensed. Ellery shifted but said nothing. His silence wasn't composed now. It was calculated restraint cracking under weight. Jasmine leaned forward. Her voice dropped. Not to intimidate, but to make them lean in. You say this was for the long-term good, but tell me, who decides what the long-term looks like, and who gets sacrificed to build it? She looked at the committee, then back at Ellery. I've read every justification your office filed. Not once did I see the word public. Not once did I see a line about consent, and certainly not a sentence about those who would be left behind. For a moment, no one moved. No camera clicked. No paper shuffled. Only the truth stood, fully exposed, daring anyone to look away. Jasmine didn't fill the silence. She knew better. Because in rooms like this, the most dangerous sound isn't shouting. It's the sound of excuses dying. The air in the room felt heavier now, like the walls themselves were absorbing every word. But Jasmine didn't pause. She reached into the binder with the calm of a surgeon and the precision of someone who'd prepared for this moment all her life. Her fingers moved past tabs like she knew each one by heart, because she did. She hadn't just collected these cases. She had lived in the echoes of every one of them. She pulled a red tab first, labeled in pen, McNary County Clinic Closure. Holding it up for all to see, she stepped toward the screen, already cued with the first remote witness. A face appeared, tired, underlit, framed by kitchen tiles and silence. Carla Jennings, former nurse practitioner, now unemployed, looked directly into the lens with eyes that had seen too much and been heard too little. I gave 21 years to that clinic, Carla began, voice soft but steady. We weren't fancy. We didn't have a cardiologist or an MRI machine, but we had insulin. We had antibiotics. We had trust. Her hands, weathered and shaking, held up a photo. A locked clinic door with a white piece of paper taped to it. It read in black ink, all caps, funding terminated, permanently closed. Carla inhaled. They told us the funding had been repurposed. That's the word they used. Like we were furniture. Jasmine watched the committee. A few shifted in their chairs. One scribbled something without looking up. But no one interrupted. No one dared. Since we closed, Carla continued, our nearest ER is 67 miles away. We've already lost 2 patients. One bled out from a ruptured ulcer waiting for a ride. Another didn't get his insulin in time. He died in his home alone. Jasmine closed the folder softly, then opened a new one. Blue tab marked Workforce Termination. AR. The screen changed. Marcus Dunn appeared, sitting in a cluttered living room, a child's backpack hanging from a chair behind him. His voice was low, laced with equal parts pride and pain. I'm not asking for pity, he started. I just want someone to admit what happened. He laid out his story with brutal clarity. Former construction foreman, laid off during an economic slump. Enrolled in a state-funded welding program through a federal retraining initiative. Had completed 6 out of 8 modules when the funding dried up overnight. No warning, no transition plan, just an email that said, program discontinued effective immediately. He held the printed email up to the camera. The ink was slightly smudged, like it had been clutched too tightly. I called. No one could explain. I begged for a waiver, an alternative. Nothing. His voice cracked but didn't break. I've got 2 kids. My son is 9. He thinks I'm on vacation. My daughter, she started asking why we have cereal for dinner. He exhaled hard, the kind of breath that comes after too many closed doors. That program was supposed to be my second chance. You took it, and no one even said my name. Jasmine turned back to the panel. Her hands didn't shake, but her voice carried the tremor of 1,000 others. What these stories show is not mismanagement. It's abandonment, structured, approved, sealed in silence. She let her gaze travel across the room, stopping on each official like a spotlight that didn't need a stage. And while they were calculating long-term returns, these people were calculating whether they could afford gas to reach the nearest food bank. The room didn't breathe, because in that moment, it wasn't just data anymore. It was America, stripped bare, speaking through the mouths of those no one invited, until today. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. The stillness around her had already done the heavy lifting. After the stories of closed clinics, canceled training programs, and evicted grandmothers, there was only one story left to tell, the smallest one, but perhaps the one that cut deepest. She reached into the binder's inside pocket, where a single white envelope, slightly crumpled at the corners, had been tucked with unusual care. She didn't place it on the table. She held it in her hand like something sacred. This, she said softly, isn't a policy brief. It's not from a department head or a caseworker. It's a letter, written by a child. The room, already heavy with the weight of consequence, grew impossibly quieter. She unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately. It was written in pencil, the handwriting uneven, with some letters capitalized randomly and others backwards. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the ache behind each word. His name is Caleb. He's 7 years old. He lives in Natchez, Mississippi. His family doesn't qualify for a meal plan anymore. Not since the funding was pulled from his school's free lunch program. Jasmine looked up briefly, scanning the room. They didn't get a phone call. They weren't told in advance. One Monday, Caleb just stopped receiving lunch at school. Her voice tightened, but never broke. He came home hungry, confused. His mother told him it was a mistake, but by Wednesday, it wasn't a mistake. It was a policy shift. Jasmine held up the letter again, the room's fluorescent lights bouncing faintly off the creased paper. He wrote this to his teacher and slipped it into her desk during recess. She read each word as if she were holding a live wire. Dear school, I'm sorry if I did something wrong. I didn't mean to. I will be good so I can eat again. Love, Caleb. The last line hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Jasmine didn't add commentary. She let the rawness of those words do what statistics could never accomplish. Then she folded the letter back into its envelope, gently, like tucking in a child who deserved better. A 7-year-old apologized, and she said quietly, because he thought hunger was his fault. She stepped toward the panel, not accusing, but unyielding. And you want to call this long-term planning? Her eyes scanned the row of officials who could no longer meet her gaze. No algorithm can explain this. No economic model can justify it. This isn't oversight. It's erasure. She placed the envelope on the table in front of her and tapped it once, softly. You can talk all you want about reallocations, metrics, and national interest. But what we have here, what this letter proves, is that someone, somewhere, looked at a number on a line item and decided it was okay if a little boy felt like a criminal just for being hungry. A few camera shutters clicked, but even they seemed cautious now, as if afraid to break the moment. Jasmine's tone never rose, but her presence had never been louder. You cannot legislate dignity back into a child after you've taken it from him, and yet here we are, trying to explain how this could have possibly happened under your watch. She stepped back, letting the envelope sit alone on the table, small and unassuming. But now everyone in the room understood. It was heavier than the entire binder. Because Caleb didn't just lose a meal, he lost something far more precious, the belief that his country saw him, cared for him, would protect him. And Jasmine Crockett had just made damn sure the system could no longer pretend it didn't know his name. The soft hum of the monitors was the only sound in the room as Jasmine stepped back from the story of Caleb, the boy who thought hunger was punishment. But the silence didn't last long. The main screen behind her flickered again, this time not as part of a presentation, but as a live request. A staffer whispered something to the committee chair. He nodded, leaned forward, and said, "We've just received a remote testimony request from Mayor Helen Dorsey of Belfield, Nebraska." Jasmine didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this one. She gave a small nod as the screen widened, revealing a modest office, bland beige walls, overworked printer in the corner, an American flag drooping slightly from its pole. At the desk sat a woman worn thin by leadership without resources, by decisions she didn't make but had to answer for. Mayor Dorsey's face came into focus. Her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness, her hair pulled back tight. Not out of vanity, but necessity. She didn't speak at first. She inhaled like it hurt, then began, not with politics, but pain. "We had just launched a mobile health unit," she said, her voice gravelly and low. It was nothing flashy, 2 vans, 3 nurses, 1 part-time doctor, but for 5 counties it meant survival. She reached off screen and held up a laminated flyer, edges curling. "We'd finally gotten dental care for kids who'd never seen a hygienist. We had prenatal checkups for expecting mothers who lived 30 miles from the nearest clinic. We had hope." Her words sped up, her tone tightening like a dam under pressure. Then without a call, without a notice, the funding vanished, just like that. Phones stopped working. Our contact at the agency didn't respond. We found out from a bounced invoice. Her hand began to tremble. She clenched it into a fist against the desk, as though trying to hold herself in place. "One of our patients, a retired factory worker named Jim, had a seizure last week. The unit had been his only point of contact for meds. He lived alone. The ambulance came. It was too late." Mayor Dorsey paused, blinking fast, trying to keep the words from crumbling as they left her mouth. "We weren't warned. We weren't consulted. We weren't even acknowledged." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of watching your community drown and being handed a paper cup to stop it. Then came the line that shattered what little composure remained in the room. "They didn't shut us down with policy. They didn't call. They just pulled the cord." It landed like a hammer in velvet. No yelling, no theatrics, just the truth, spoken plainly, and in doing so, made more violent. The screen froze on her image, eyes wide, jaw trembling mid-sentence. A digital portrait of helplessness inflicted by indifference. Jasmine stepped forward, her heels clicking like punctuation on a truth no one could erase. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "They didn't even give her town the decency of a warning," she said, "because in this system, some communities don't even get the courtesy of being told they're being erased." Her hand gestured toward the screen, still frozen on Mayor Dorsey's face. "This isn't about an error. This was a choice, a decision made in an office far from Belfield, made by people who will never have to sit across from a widow and explain why the nurse she trusted is gone." Jasmine's voice sharpened with every word, but her tone remained coldly surgical. "You didn't just pull a budget line. You pulled the only heartbeat that town had left. And then you walked away without looking back. Every official on the panel now sat still, no longer shielded by talking points or procedure. Jasmine's words had dragged the cost of their silence into the room and set it down in front of them, where it could no longer be ignored. And as the screen behind her dimmed to black, the only image left was the outline of a woman who had begged for help and instead was handed absence. The screen behind Jasmine dimmed, but the tension in the room only intensified. After the testimony of Mayor Dorsey, raw, unfiltered, unforgettable, every eye turned to Judge Richard Ellery. This was his moment to respond, to reckon, to account. But instead of reflection, he reached for refuge. The judge leaned toward his microphone, adjusted his cufflinks with the precision of a man trained to perform calm under fire, and began, not with apology, not with acknowledgement, but with defense. "Let me be clear," he said, voice cool, rehearsed, detached. "None of the decisions referenced today were made unilaterally. There was no malice, no oversight failure. These were coordinated reallocations, reviewed and approved according to legal and institutional frameworks." His tone was clean, crisp, polished like a courtroom closing argument, but cold, so cold it chilled the human cost from his words. Jasmine stood motionless, watching him carefully, like someone watching a house burn while the arsonist explained the heat. Judge Ellery continued, unflinching. "We followed all procedural standards. The suggestion that these decisions were made in secret or without accountability is simply inaccurate. There was no targeted harm. These were structural adjustments made in light of evolving national priorities. Difficult choices, yes, but necessary ones." His hands never shook. His face remained impassive. But behind the calm facade was the unmistakable sound of someone fortifying a wall they knew had already cracked. Then came the line that ignited the room. "If there were unintended consequences, we regret them. But regret is not the same as wrongdoing." The words fell like ice across a table already scorched by truth. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She let the silence do the work, let the arrogance settle and stain. Around the chamber, jaws tightened, pens dropped, and even the committee members looked unsure whether they had just witnessed leadership or evasion dressed in judicial robes. Because in that moment, the system didn't just deny accountability, it declared itself untouchable. And Jasmine Crockett, standing amid the wreckage of numbers with names and policies, with victims, knew exactly what kind of fire that denial needed to meet. Judge Ellery's cold denial still lingered in the air, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't waste a second arguing with polished indifference. Instead, she turned, deliberate, steady, toward a whiteboard placed at the side of the room. The cameras pivoted to follow her. What had seemed like a simple diagram now became the courtroom's most damning piece of evidence. Jasmine picked up a black marker, circled the top box on the flowchart, discretionary override, then traced her finger down the arrows. No audit required. No external review. No congressional briefing. Her voice sliced through the silence like a scalpel. "This," she said, "is the process by which nearly $2 billion disappeared. Not with debate, not with oversight, but with the stroke of a pen, behind closed doors, and without a single vote cast by an elected official." The lines on the chart weren't just procedural. They were the tracks of a system designed not to serve the public, but to bypass it entirely. She tapped the final box in the diagram. No accountability. Her tone darkened, not loud but weighted, like a quiet verdict being handed down. This isn't just flawed, it's designed to avoid resistance, to remove every guardrail meant to protect the public. And then she dropped the truth that detonated through the chamber like a depth charge. She turned a page in her binder, pulled out a printed ledger of reallocation destinations, and held it high. Over 60% of those funds didn't stay here. They were transferred to offshore development initiatives, international infrastructure deals, strategic partnerships with foreign entities, projects with no clear metrics, no public reporting, no public benefit, and no American oversight. A gasp rippled through the room. Even some of the most seasoned committee members leaned forward, eyes wide, jaws tight. Jasmine walked back toward the diagram, underlining 3 words scrawled in bold beneath the process flow. No vote, no warning, no trace. She turned, scanning every face at the panel. We told our citizens that sacrifices were being made for efficiency, for sustainability, for future generations. But what we didn't tell them is that their sacrifices were being shipped overseas, quietly, conveniently, without a headline. She paused just long enough to let the betrayal fully take root. So when Judge Ellery says this was legal, maybe. But if legality has become a shield for silence, then this chamber has a far bigger problem than budget cuts. It has a crisis of trust, and trust, once broken, doesn't come back with excuses. Her finger rested on the word override one last time, and this time, her voice didn't just carry, it condemned. What do you call a government that rewrites priorities without asking permission, hides the consequences, and exports the cost? She stared directly at Ellery. You call it what it is, unaccountable power, and I'm here to end it. The air was already strained, stretched tight from the weight of exposed truths and brutal clarity. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not while one voice remained unheard, the smallest voice, yet the most piercing. She reached into her binder again, this time with the care of someone holding something fragile, sacred. She pulled out a single page, folded once, the paper soft from being handled too many times. It wasn't printed, it wasn't formatted. It was written in blue crayon on lined notebook paper, with the faintest smudge of peanut butter near the corner. She held it up, not for display, but as proof that even a child had begun to notice the silence of the system around him. Her voice dropped, low, grounded, and impossibly steady. This letter, she said, was given to me by a third-grade teacher in Detroit. It was written by one of her students, Jamal, after she told her class their after-school reading program had been discontinued. She unfolded the page gently, as if unfolding the question the country hadn't been brave enough to answer. And then, without embellishment, she read, Dear Miss Crockett, my name is Jamal. We can't do reading club no more. Miss Thomas said it's 'cause there's no more money. My mommy said maybe the school's broken. But I just want to know, did we lose our books 'cause we poor? Did we get cut 'cause we don't got money? I promise I'll read harder next time. She stopped reading. She didn't add a dramatic pause. She let the rawness of those words do what entire hearings often failed to do. Bring the system face to face with what it had become. Jasmine folded the letter back with precision and placed it on the desk in front of her like it was evidence in a murder trial. Then she looked up, slowly scanning the panel. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened with intent. That boy didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for fairness. And what he got was a closed door and a quiet cut. No announcement, no press conference. Just gone. Judge Ellery didn't move at first. For a moment he looked carved from stone, jaw locked, eyes unmoving, hands folded so tightly the knuckles paled. But beneath the facade something cracked, not visibly, not loudly, but the denial, the rehearsed stillness, the cold assurance began to erode. He blinked slowly, as if seeing something he couldn't unsee. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Because how do you defend a system so numb that a child thinks poverty is a punishment? The silence wrapped the chamber like smoke, thick and unbreathable. Then, a chair shifted. A figure stood. Not one of the usual speakers. It was Congressman Walter Hemsworth, a senior representative from Ohio, known more for committee attendance than public statements. His voice was raspy from age or disuse. But when he spoke, the room listened. I'll be honest, he began. When I saw this hearing on the schedule, I thought it was noise. Political noise. Grandstanding. Another budget fight dressed up in emotion. He paused not to gather his thoughts, but to choose his next words with surgical care. But what I've seen today, it isn't noise, it's a mirror. One that's been kept in a closet too long. He looked around the chamber, then back to Jasmine. This system isn't broken because it makes tough choices. It's broken because it hides them, because it hurts quietly in places none of us have the courage to visit. He pointed, not to a document, not to a chart, but to the letter lying in front of Jasmine. That boy asked a question none of us here were brave enough to ask. Did we get cut because we don't got money? His voice caught, just for a moment. And I don't have an answer, but I know this. Not answering is no longer acceptable. Jasmine nodded once, not in triumph, but in recognition, because the truth had done what it was supposed to do. It had woken something up. Not everyone, not yet, but enough. Enough to begin. The last echoes of Congressman Hemsworth's words were still fading when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every person in that chamber was already leaning in. Their world, once bulletproof behind layers of legalese and procedural indifference, had begun to crack. And Jasmine, she was the wedge. She walked with calm, controlled gravity to the whiteboard at the edge of the room. It had been there the whole time, ignored, like so much of the truth in Washington. But now it was the centerpiece. She picked up a thick black marker and faced the board. Her hand moved with precision, drawing a diagram as simple as it was damning. At the top, a rectangle labeled discretionary override. An arrow pointed downward to another box, internal memo. Another arrow, silent execution. At the end, circled in red, was one final box. No oversight, no accountability, no record. The silence deepened. Some in the audience were taking notes. Others had stopped. Their pens hung mid-air like question marks. Jasmine turned back to face the panel, marker still in hand. This, she said, gesturing to the diagram behind her, is how nearly $2 billion disappeared. A few heads tilted, a rustle from the back. Judge Ellery folded his hands again, this time tighter. Jasmine didn't glance at him. No votes, no public hearings, no state consultations, just a single directive. One clause buried in an appendix. One decision made in a closed room by someone whose name the public will never know. And just like that, money meant for schools, hospitals, job programs was gone. The sound that followed wasn't noise. It was realization, the kind that doesn't explode but unfolds. A new awareness passing like a ripple through the crowd. Committee members shifted in their chairs as if trying to subtly distance themselves from what they had just learned. Jasmine tapped the first box, discretionary override. This clause was never meant to be routine. It was built for actual emergencies, war, disaster, catastrophic failure. But in the last 2 years, it's been invoked over 400 times. She let that number settle. No spin, no exaggeration, just the math. 400 budget decisions made without public record, under a clause no one debates and no one tracks. She moved to the next box, internal memo. These reallocations don't go through elected representatives. They go through 2 layers of internal review, where every red flag is labeled classified and every concern is buried under the phrase strategic necessity. She turned to the final box. Silent execution. That's where the programs die, quietly, without press releases, without closure, no accountability, no hearings, just absence. Her tone shifted, not louder but sharper, more surgical. This is how the housing assistants in Belfield vanished. This is how Jamal lost his reading program. This is how a clinic in Tennessee closed 2 weeks before flu season. She took a step forward, past the board, past the comfort of abstraction. You didn't just lose track of money, you built a process that ensured you wouldn't have to face what happened after it moved. The weight of her words landed with the precision of a courtroom verdict. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't stutter. She reached into her folder again and pulled out a printed breakdown, page after page of redirected funding lists. She raised one page, highlighted in yellow. The committee screens mirrored it behind her. 62%, she said flatly. That's how much of the reallocated money went to foreign infrastructure projects. Gasps this time. Audible. Jasmine continued. Strategic partners, foreign ports, digital connectivity programs in Europe and Asia, consulting contracts with overseas firms. Not humanitarian aid, not disaster relief, infrastructure. She took a breath, not because she needed it, but because the room did. I'm not here to argue against diplomacy or collaboration or responsible international spending. But let's be crystal clear. This money wasn't excess. It wasn't optional. It was taken directly from domestic programs already approved, already funded, already in motion. She held up another page, this one labeled Reallocation Ledger FY 2024 Q2. $175 million was pulled from Department of Education rural grants, another $82 million from HUD's transitional housing initiatives, $59 million from mobile health expansion under the Department of Health and Human Services. She turned to the board, drew one final arrow beneath the process diagram, and in large capital letters wrote, "The cost." Then she turned back, eyes scanning the room with unwavering focus. That cost wasn't in billions or millions. It was in meals, in medicine, in housing vouchers, in childhood literacy, in lives. There was no air left in the room. Even the reporters stopped typing. Jasmine walked to the committee table, placed the printed ledger in front of them, and said, "You didn't just redirect funds, you redirected futures." She let the words hang, like a verdict too devastating to explain. Then she looked directly at Judge Ellery, not with malice, but with unflinching truth. "And Judge, if your justification is that it followed protocol, then your protocol is broken." The tension in the room rose to a boiling point. Jasmine could feel it, and so could every official in that chamber. But she didn't retreat. She stepped closer to the panel. This process wasn't careless. It was calculated, designed to avoid attention, designed to skip scrutiny, and it worked, until now. She pointed at the diagram again. Every committee member turned to look. "You asked for answers. I gave you the map. You wanted proof. You're holding it in your hands. But if you walk out of this room today pretending this was just another hearing, then you're part of the design." She paused, her breath steady, her voice low, but undeniably firm. "You can no longer claim ignorance. Not after today, not after this." And with that, she stepped back, binder closed, eyes unwavering. The truth had struck, not with fury, but with precision. And the room, once indifferent, once distant, now felt smaller. Not because the walls had moved, but because the veil had been ripped away. And no one, not even Judge Richard Ellery, could unsee what had just been drawn in black ink, spoken in hard truth, and burned into memory. The room was motionless, not because people were calm, but because they were paralyzed by the clarity of what had just been exposed. The air itself had weight now. Every breath felt thick, as if the oxygen had been replaced with consequence. Jasmine Crockett had just sketched the anatomy of betrayal in black marker, and there was no looking away. She had peeled back the polished language of bureaucracy and shown it for what it really was. A machine designed to move billions without looking into the eyes of the people it stripped bare. Then came the chime. A soft ding echoed through the chamber like the first drop of rain before a storm. It came from the lead committee aide's tablet. He glanced down, then toward the chair. Confused, he leaned in and whispered something. The chair blinked, then raised an eyebrow. "Another remote speaker request," he announced. "This one isn't scheduled." There was a pause, a long one, the kind of pause that used to mean deny it. But something had shifted. Denial was no longer safe. The chair gave a nod. "Let it in." The monitors blinked. A loading wheel spun. Then a face appeared. A middle-aged woman, dark circles under her eyes, sitting in a school hallway with a whiteboard behind her that read, "5th grade, Miss B." Her name was Leanne Brody, a public school teacher from Western Kentucky. The connection wasn't perfect. Her audio crackled, her video was slightly off-center, but her message was clear. "I didn't think I'd ever be on a screen like this," she began, adjusting the camera with shaking hands. "I've been watching this hearing, and I couldn't stay silent." The room, once governed by rules and rhythms, was now held captive by the unscripted. No one spoke. No one dared cut her off. "Last year, my school lost its literacy support staff. We were told the funding had been reallocated for national priorities. So now I run reading groups during lunch. I buy books from Goodwill. We use old vocabulary cards from the 1990s. But my kids don't know that. They still come in, still hope. And I've just been praying every day that someone up there would finally listen." She looked directly into the camera, not at Jasmine, not at the panel, but at the people watching from home. So if you're watching this, if you're part of the reason my kids no longer get help learning to read, I want you to hear something. They still believe in you, but I don't know how long that will last. She signed off. The screen faded, but the silence she left behind didn't. Then before anyone could process, another chime, another feed request, this time from a man in a mechanic's jumpsuit standing in front of a chain-link fence with a faded UAW logo behind him. His name tag read Oscar L. He spoke with calloused hands and the kind of voice that sounded like it had argued with machines and won, until the government pulled his job training funding mid-program. I was laid off after 33 years. Thought I'd never have to start over, but I was ready. Signed up for a workforce retraining course. Mechatronics. We were halfway through when we got an email. Program canceled. No refund. No backup. Nothing. They just told us the budget was restructured. His voice rose, not with rage, but the desperation of someone who'd run out of ways to explain disappointment to his family. I sat at the kitchen table that night and told my wife I'd find another way. But there ain't another way. Not at 56. Not in my town. The screen cut to black. Before anyone could speak, a third chime, then a fourth, then 6 more. One by one, feeds flooded in. A nurse in North Dakota, a social worker in New Mexico, a foster parent in Ohio, an EMT in rural Alabama, a janitor from a shuttered school in South Carolina. Each story came not as testimony, but as rescue flares. Each voice, trembling or furious, cracked the foundation of indifference. Each face said what policy documents couldn't. We were here the whole time. You just stopped seeing us. And Jasmine? Jasmine stood back and let it happen. She didn't need to speak now. She had lit the match. Now the truth was burning on its own. Some feeds weren't polished. Some broke mid-sentence, but that only made them more real. We lost our mobile mental health unit last spring. Since then, we've had 3 suicides in our county, all teenagers. I run a veterans outreach center. We were supposed to get funding for trauma counseling. It got pulled. My brother was on that wait list. He OD'd last month. These weren't statistics. These were exhibits. Undeniable, unsanitized, unfiltered. Members of the press gallery who had long since stopped taking notes were now recording directly. The hashtag # voices from the cuts began trending in real time. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. Within minutes, clips of the remote testimonies flooded social media platforms, stitched together with Jasmine's diagram, Mayor Dorsey's heartbreak, and Caleb's crayon-scrawled question. And inside the hearing room, something unprecedented happened. A second committee member stood, then a third, then 6 more. Congresswoman Leanne Boucher, known more for her centrist compromise than her courage, was the first to speak. I've been in public service for 21 years. I've sat through thousands of hearings, and I can honestly say I've never been this ashamed of what I didn't know. She turned to her colleagues, eyes wet but steady. This isn't just about reallocations. This is about trust. And today, the people we swore to serve are speaking, loudly, clearly, directly. One by one, others followed, not with speeches, but with a sentence, a gesture, a nod, like a body slowly waking from coma. Even the most guarded began to shift. Even Judge Ellery, still seated, still silent, was no longer hiding behind the illusion of control. His hands, once folded in steely precision, now rested open on the table. Empty. The chair of the committee looked to Jasmine. Miss Crockett, would you like to speak again? She shook her head gently, then raised her hand to the monitor wall, where a single feed still played. A mother holding her child in her lap, whispering, "They deserve better." Jasmine turned back to the room. That's the last word that needs to be said, for now. Because today she hadn't spoken for them. She had spoken with them, and now the country was listening. For the first time all morning, Judge Richard Ellery was no longer in control. Not of the room, not of the narrative, not even of himself. The storm Jasmine Crockett had brought into the hearing hadn't come in the form of fury or shouting. It came like erosion, slow, steady, merciless. One truth at a time, one voice at a time. And now, after hours of silence dressed as stoicism, Ellery was starting to fray, not in any obvious way. His voice hadn't cracked, his hands hadn't shaken, yet, but his armor had begun to sink. You could see it in his eyes. Where there had once been steely detachment, now there was stillness laced with a flicker of fear. He sat there, shoulders no longer squared but slightly slumped, as the testimony of everyday Americans, streamed in by the dozen, continued playing behind Jasmine. It was no longer a hearing, it was a reckoning. And the man who had authored the discretionary override memos, the one who had signed off on the quiet death of public programs with clinical precision, was now the one being watched. Jasmine hadn't even addressed him directly in over 20 minutes. She didn't have to. The people had taken over, and that was what finally began to undo him. He turned his gaze down, ostensibly to review documents on the desk, but the pages remained untouched. His hands, once confidently folded, now rested apart. Open, vulnerable. He looked less like a judge and more like a man discovering, for the first time, just how far the consequences of his decisions had traveled. The committee chair cleared his throat. "Judge Ellery," he said softly, "you've heard the testimony. The documentation, the real-time accounts. Do you have a response?" The room froze. Every journalist readied their hands. Every aide stopped pretending to work. Cameras angled themselves like vultures circling a long-delayed moment. Ellery's mouth opened slightly, closed again, then opened once more. "I believed in the structure." His voice wasn't weak. It was naked. And in Ellery's world, that was far more dangerous than weakness. "I believed that within the process, fairness would be preserved. That if we followed the framework, it would balance itself." He looked up, not at Jasmine, but at the whiteboard still displaying her diagram. "I was wrong." The room didn't move. He wasn't done. "What Miss Crockett showed you today was not just failure. It was neglect masquerading as policy. It was compliance without conscience." That landed like a tremor. Not because of the words, but because of who said them. "I didn't ask the second question. I didn't challenge the assumptions. I didn't look beyond the paper." He inhaled sharply. A crack formed in his voice. Not loud, but sharp, unmistakable. "Because if I had, I would have had to see the people." His eyes found Jasmine now. For the first time all day they locked, not as adversaries, but as one who had built the machine and one who had been fighting it her entire life. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply held his gaze, unwavering. "Because this wasn't forgiveness. This was recognition," Ellery continued. "I approved over 90% of the override applications presented to my office in the last fiscal cycle. I signed off on them in batches. I trusted the analysts. I trusted the language." He looked down again, voice lower. "I didn't trust the people." A long pause. He rubbed his forehead now, small, weary circles, like trying to erase something already carved in. "You asked me earlier if I had anything to say in defense? I don't." He gestured toward the monitor wall still showing multiple remote speakers waiting to be heard. "Because how do you defend a system that tells a nurse to work without meds, a veteran to sleep in a car, or a child that reading is only for the rich?" The sound in the room wasn't silence anymore. It was breathlessness. Even the committee members, some of whom had once relied on Ellery's counsel like gospel, now looked at him differently. Not with betrayal, but with the disquieting realization that their house had been burning long before the smoke was visible. And in the middle of it stood the man who lit the match. Not out of malice, but because he'd been taught to look away from the flames. Jasmine finally stepped forward, not as a prosecutor, not as a politician, but as a witness to the moment where denial collapsed under the weight of reality. "Judge," she said softly, "you weren't alone." Ellery looked at her, unsure whether it was condemnation or comfort. She clarified, "A system isn't just one man with a pen. It's the silence that follows after he signs. You didn't break it, but you stopped questioning it, and that is why we're here." He nodded once, barely. "So what happens now?" Jasmine turned toward the room, toward the committee, toward the cameras, toward the people still waiting in queues, still refreshing live streams, still hoping today wasn't just a moment, but a turning point. "Now," she said, lifting her voice just enough for the nation to hear. Now we stop pretending this was isolated. We name it, we trace it, and we dismantle the loopholes that let it happen. She walked toward Ellery's end of the table, not confrontational, but intentional. And maybe, she added, pausing before delivering the line that would dominate headlines, the judge finally becomes the witness. The room exhaled. Ellery bowed his head slightly, not in shame, but in surrender. Not to Jasmine, not to the committee, but to the truth. And in that moment, the collapse wasn't tragic. It was necessary, because for a new system to rise, the old one had to fall, quietly, completely, and in full view of the people it had long ignored. Judge Ellery's confession didn't end the hearing. It detonated it. For hours, the chamber had been a furnace of testimonies, data, and disillusionment. But with Ellery's voice trembling beneath the weight of his own silence, the dam broke. The system could no longer claim it hadn't heard. And more importantly, it could no longer claim it hadn't understood. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless as the dust settled. Her face was unreadable, not smug, not even victorious, just ready. Because this was the moment every hard-won truth demanded. Response. The committee chair, a silver-haired man whose reputation had long rested on cautious moderation, leaned forward, his fingers pressed against the polished desk, as if bracing for a shift that would come not as a political motion, but as a moral necessity. "Miss Crockett," he said, voice heavier than it had been all day, "I want to thank you." He looked to his left, to his colleagues, some shaken, some shamefaced, some wide-eyed in late awakening. This hearing was never intended to go this deep, but now that it has, we can't walk out of here and pretend we didn't see what we saw. He turned to the room, straightened his notes, then, without hesitation, lifted his microphone and said the words that would alter the legislative trajectory of a generation. Effective immediately, I move to freeze all discretionary budget override powers across federal agencies until independent audits are conducted. The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. It exhaled, and that single breath carried with it the sound of something shifting. Jasmine didn't speak yet. She watched, because the tide wasn't just turning, it was listening. A younger congresswoman, not yet 40, known more for her Instagram than her legislative muscle, stood next, but her voice was steeled. "We need a task force," she said clearly, "built not around bureaucrats, but community representatives, nurses, teachers, veterans, the people whose lives these numbers touch." Another voice followed, an older congressman from a Rust Belt district long forgotten by both parties. "We need criminal referrals. If decisions were made under false pretenses, if audits were falsified, if lives were lost because someone signed off on cuts they knew would harm, there has to be legal accountability, not just political fallout." His words weren't loud, but they hit like a thunderclap. For the first time, the discussion in the hearing was no longer about what went wrong. It was about how to make it right. The panel began coordinating live. Legal aides whispering urgently, emails flying, proposals being drafted on the spot. Every screen lit up. The official record now read, "Oversight Protocol Reform, in progress." Jasmine moved to the center of the floor, not to reclaim the mic, but to direct the momentum. "This change must start with a few simple principles," she said. "Transparency, community oversight, and, most importantly, consequences." She pointed toward the whiteboard where her process diagram still stood. "This cannot be just a freeze. It has to be a rebuild. Because what we're looking at is a system designed to operate best when no one's watching. That ends today." The chair nodded. "We'll put it to a vote. Emergency session, full committee." But then, something unexpected. A young black staffer, maybe 25, stepped forward from the back of the room. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't even supposed to be visible. But she held up a tablet and spoke into the silence. "Miss Crockett," she said, voice shaking slightly, "we're trending in 39 states, and the hashtag is being used by congressional candidates, school board members, and mayors. This isn't just going viral. It's becoming a demand." Jasmine turned slowly. "What hashtag?" The young woman smiled through the weight of it all. "Reclaim the budget." It wasn't slick. It wasn't corporate. It was raw. But it meant one thing. The people were no longer waiting for permission. Outside the building, the sound was rising, not in protest, but in purpose. The crowd that had gathered during the hearing had nearly doubled. Teachers, nurses, parents, veterans. They weren't chanting now. They were organizing. A pop-up table had been set up with laptops. People were signing petitions. Volunteers with clipboards were collecting district names, stories, testimonies. And then came the moment that burned itself into the memory of every person in the room. A second staffer rushed in, whispered into the chair's ear, and handed over a folded paper. The chair opened it, blinked, and looked at Jasmine. We just received a resolution proposal from over 60 city mayors across the country. They're asking to participate in federal budget reform workshops. They want their communities at the table. Jasmine didn't smile. She nodded, because this was what she had asked for. Not a headline, not applause, but ownership. The hearing, once formal and rehearsed, had become something else entirely, a living movement. Then came the chair's final statement for the day, spoken not as a politician, but as a man who had just witnessed the turning of a moral tide. Miss Crockett, the people you've brought into this room today, physically, virtually, emotionally, they've just changed the conversation, and in doing so, they've changed us. He looked down at the whiteboard again. This diagram will be archived as part of the permanent record. And then gently he added, but let's make sure it doesn't remain a blueprint for power. Let's make it a warning. Jasmine took one last look around the room. The whiteboard, the screens, the faces, some red with shame, some lit with resolve. And she said one final thing before stepping down. If we're brave enough to admit the system was rigged, then we must be brave enough to unrig it. Brick by brick, budget line by budget line, in the open, where the people can see. And with that, she walked away from the mic, not with her binder, not with a gavel, but with something far stronger. Momentum, real, tangible, unstoppable. The hearing room emptied slowly, not because people were ready to leave, but because they didn't want to forget how this felt. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, something real had happened within those walls. Not political theater, not posturing, but something raw, undeniable, and human. Jasmine Crockett stayed seated long after the cameras were shut off. Her binder sat closed beside her, dog-eared and worn. Not a weapon anymore, not a shield, just what it had always been, a record of the unheard, a testimony in pages. She looked out at the nearly empty gallery. Staffers moved quietly with new urgency. Journalists whispered behind their phones. And on the walls, her diagram still stood. The process flow of a system that had been exposed in daylight for the first time. Oversight, finally, in the light of day. She took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just a simple breath. The kind people forget to take when they've been fighting for too long. Then came a tap on her shoulder. It was the young congressional staffer from earlier, the one who'd read Jamal's letter, the one who stood when others sat. Miss Crockett, she said gently, there's someone waiting for you outside. Jasmine nodded, gathered her things and stood. The hallways weren't silent, but they weren't chaotic either. They hummed with a new kind of energy, determined, focused. She passed by people she didn't know, but they all looked at her like they did. A nod, a whisper, a single word murmured over and over. Thank you. Outside the building, the scene had transformed. The protest signs were gone, not discarded, but replaced. Now people held clipboards. They were forming lines, not to shout, but to register, to volunteer, to stay. The movement hadn't ended inside that chamber. It had been born there. A group of teachers stood off to the left, handing out printouts of Jasmine's flowchart. Someone had already turned it into a flyer. Another had turned it into a PowerPoint template. Local organizers were turning it into training material for civic transparency workshops. It was becoming something permanent. Jasmine stepped down the marble steps slowly, her heels clicking softly against stone. When she reached the bottom, she spotted a boy standing in the middle of the crowd. 7, maybe 8. He held a small envelope in his hands. She didn't recognize him at first until he said, "I'm Jamal." Her breath caught, not because it was him, but because he came. "My teacher said you read my letter," he added, barely above a whisper. "I saw you on her computer." Jasmine knelt to his level, her voice gentle. "I did, and I kept it with me all day." He held out the envelope. "I wrote another one, in case someone else forgets." She took it with both hands, no cameras, no speeches. Just a transfer of belief from one generation to the next. "You didn't lose your books because you were poor, Jamal," she said quietly. "You lost them because grown-ups forgot to protect what matters. But we're fixing that now. You helped fix that." He nodded, smiling like he finally believed her. Then turned and ran back to a woman waiting by the sidewalk, his mother, who wiped her eyes and waved. Behind Jasmine, someone else was approaching, Congresswoman Hartley, still in her heels, still carrying the same folder she had held during the hearing. "You should know," she said, "the oversight suspension bill is going into drafting tonight, and we want you in the room when it's written." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Only if the people who showed up today are in that room too." Hartley smiled. "That's the idea." They shook hands, not as politicians, as co-conspirators in the rebirth of public accountability. Jasmine turned back to the crowd. She didn't wave. She didn't posture. She just stood there watching democracy realign itself around the people who'd always been left behind. Across the plaza, someone had set up a whiteboard and was drawing her diagram again, this time in red and green markers. High school students were gathered around, asking questions. A teacher handed out blank copies and said, "Today we teach this, not for the test, for life." Someone else had set up a table labeled Budget Watchdogs. Another read, Community Review Sign-Up. It was no longer Jasmine's moment, it was theirs, and she was exactly where she belonged. One voice among many, no longer shouting to be heard, but listening because people finally were. She turned toward the edge of the crowd, where a single protest sign still remained. It wasn't angry, it wasn't accusatory, it was handwritten in thick black marker, and it simply said, "Silence is how they forgot us. Speaking is how we remember ourselves." She smiled. Not out of relief, but because she knew now, this wouldn't end here. They would try again, those who wanted silence, those who wanted shadows. But now the people had a flashlight, and they were learning to use it. That evening, Jasmine sat in a small DC cafe with her binder in her lap and a hot tea steaming in front of her. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. Press requests, message notifications, invitations to panels and town halls and networks she'd once been excluded from. She didn't open them. Not yet. She pulled out Jamal's second letter and unfolded it slowly. It read, "Dear Miss Crockett, I still want to read. Can I help you help the other kids too? I'm not afraid no more. You made it okay." She placed the letter back in the binder, closed it, and exhaled. Not in exhaustion, but in beginning. Because change doesn't happen in thunder. It happens in moments like this, when one person dares to show the system what it's supposed to be, and others dare to believe it can be more. Jasmine Crockett had not come to lead a movement. She had come to speak a truth. But when truth is finally heard, people move. And when people move, everything changes. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.